Welcome to Strategic Insight from the Center of Leadership and Diplomacy. Today, we want to talk about the hot news about the war between Israel, United States, and Iran. And in this session, we will illustrate the following points: the objectives and payoffs, worst outcomes, credibility traps, miscalculations and information problems, new strategic variables introduced by the active warfare now, updating strategic interpretation, and what to expect in the coming days in terms of exits and scenarios. What are the critical turning points and who are the winners and losers? Now, as we see, the war is between three parts: USA, Israel, and Iran. And the question is, what are the goals and payoffs of these parties? For Israel, the goal is clear as the regime destruction as soon as possible and as much as they can. For the USA, the goal is changing the regime, finishing the nuclear program, limited missiles program, and stopping the proxies. That's what we hear from them. And for Iran, of course, since Iran now in the position of defense, the top goal of Iran is regime survival at any cost. Then Iran may try to raise US costs regionally, bombing Israel with missiles to raise the cost for Israel, and trying to split the alliance between Israel and the United States and create sort of international economic pressure. That means Iran internationalizes the cost. And about the worst outcomes. For the United States, the worst outcome, in fact, is extended large-scale regional war. So America, I think, doesn't want to reach this worst outcome. Plus a global economic crisis. And the second worst outcome for the United States is the war that fails to degrade Iranian regime and leaving long-term instability. Meanwhile, for the Israel, the worst outcome is the huge damage and destruction for its cities. And the second worst is U.S. disengagement in the midst of this conflict. And is that possible? We want to see that. For Iran, the worst outcome is the total military defeat plus regime collapse. And the second worst for Iran is the loss of strategic deterrence and regional influence and sort of infrastructure damage that is happening right now. So now we are in a three-actor dynamic with multiple feedback loops. Could we notice divergent worst outcomes between the US and Israel? Israel, in fact, the main goal is for them is to destroy the regime or remove the regime. So regime survival for Israel is unacceptable. For the United States, prolonged regional war is unacceptable. When allies have different worst outcomes, the alliance in fact becomes strategically unstable. Divergent worst outcomes will usually leads to escalation coordination problems. Could this divergence be reached? We will see that in the coming scenarios. There is another issue, which is the credibility traps, which are now central. This war shows classic features of credibility traps. Public commitment to victory mean leaders cannot easily back down without fury at home, especially the internal politics issues. Trump's, for example, statements about continuing the campaign and not being afraid to send group forces signal political cost for de-escalation. At the same time, Israel has framed this as historic struggle for survival that increases domestic pressure to press on and to continue in this war. In other words, leaders are now caught in a credibility trap because de-escalation early could be seen domestically and allied as weakness, even when continuing carries high cost. This is one of the deadliest traps in strategic interaction because it turns unwillingness to back down into a driver of escalation. The other issue is miscalculation and information problems. In war, miscalculations are more dangerous than in crisis bargaining. For example, Iran may miscalculate or miscompute the US and Israel red lines regarding how far retaliation is tolerated. At the same time, the US may misread Iran's internal resolve or proxy networks. Also, Israel's decisions are influenced by its own alliance logic and the threat perceptions, especially the United States, if there could be sort of contradiction between both of them. And also the non-state actors, that is groups aligned with Iran, may escalate independently without the orders from Iran or coordination with Iran. This increases the chance of no strategic exit, which is exactly how rational actors can end up in unwanted war. The other issue is what are the new strategic variables introduced by the active war right now? External support and coalition politics. At this moment, Russia and China have voiced concern about this, but up to this moment, they didn't offer any serious steps toward this war. UK participates in Gulf protection. France sent its aircraft carrier. Gulf states and other regional actors could join or mediate. So now we cannot say there is external alliances or coalition now in the moment, but there is like the early steps for that. And we will see is this is going to be developed as external support and coalition. We will see in the coming days. Therefore, this is the beginning of international engagement. It is, as we said, it is just beginning. It is not a real international engagement. In terms of domestic and political feedback, U.S. public support for war is reportedly about maybe 25, according to some reports, making sustained conflict a political risk at home inside the United States. At the same time, Iranian domestic reaction could be either radicalization or mobilization, both affecting the strategic payoffs for Iran. And in terms of the economic payoffs, like Strait of Hormuz, disruption impacts global energy markets and economic stability, raising the cost of continuing war. Up to this moment, sort of updated strategic interpretation, we are now no longer in bargaining equilibrium. We are in a multi-actor escalation dynamic where credibility traps are pushing leaders toward continued fighting. Worse outcomes have shifted. Now actors fear not just war, but losing control over its direction. And the payoff functions have changed due to the assassination of leadership, especially for Iran, and the massive strikes and the broad retaliation. The costs are increasing exponentially, especially economic and alliance costs. Exits are getting towards being harder because early withdrawal could be interpreted as a defeat, both domestically and regionally. In other words, the conflict illustrates a classic escalation spiral in strategic logic: mutual threats, historical grievances, overlapping worst outcomes, political pressures that make pulling back costly, and religious influence, as we see now in the United States, what they call it, like, some of them, they call it like a God plan. On the ground, U.S.-Israel is practicing air campaign and it is ongoing. Israel signals that campaign could take weeks, as well as also the United States. There's expanded air campaign targeting leadership and strategic systems inside Iran. That is war of attrition against Iran capabilities. This will take weeks, with a higher regional spillover, mainly in terms of major oil and gas shock. For Iran, retaliating regionally, and there's missiles and the drones that attacks on U.S. interests in the Gulf, and also some civil targets in the Gulf countries as well. Also, there is sort of regional spillover risk because these strikes, retaliation, touching multiple theaters and raising energy and shipping risk, especially for Hormuz disruptions. What is expected in the coming days? US-Israel impose wider target sets, sustain regional operations, and then the question is, what are the scenarios of ending the war, or what the exit in terms of strategy? I think we have four about scenarios or exits. The first scenario or first exit is unilateral cessation of war from the side of the United States. This is a result of divergent, could be, it is a result of divergent negative outcomes for the United States and Israel, as previously mentioned, or because the internal political issues, calculations will push toward this unilateral cessation of war from the side of the United States. Since Israel regime survival, Israel considered that survival of the Iranian regime may be unacceptable, while United States considers prolonged regional war is unacceptable. And as we said, when allies have divergent negative outcomes, the alliance becomes strategically unstable, and divergent negative outcomes usually lead to problems in coordinating escalation. Therefore, President Trump unilaterally ends the war as he did in 2025 during the 12 days war against Iran. So he did it before, and it is expected, for example, it could be done in this scenario. In this scenario, President Trump is satisfied with the major objectives he has achieved, such as the assassination of the supreme leader, the destruction of the remaining nuclear reactors and ballistic missiles depots, the killing of senior military and political leaders of the regime, the destruction of the Iranian Navy, and the destruction of the main capabilities of the army and the Revolutionary Guard. So he may consider these are big results that he achieved it and then stop the war. This is, in fact, the easiest and the quickest way out, as it stops the war without the need for pre-arrangements, establishes that America, not Israel, controls the decision to go to war from beginning to end. 3, does not commit the United States to anything, leaving the option of resuming war open again. Number 4, allows for a return to negotiations, but under conditions less favorable than those offered by the Iranians on Thursday, February 26th of February. And 5, alleviates pressure from domestic American public opinion. This is the first scenario, which is the easiest and maybe could be the quickest one. The second scenario is the moderate, that creating or changing the regime to a moderate regime, not like the regime as it is now, like sort of tapped regime. This scenario will require de-escalation towards rising of Iranian leaders willing to make serious concessions while maintaining the structure of the regime. So this scenario, it is a moderate regime, will be rise the same political structure, but with different leaders who are willing to make serious concessions while maintaining, in fact, as we said, the structure of the political regime as is. The indicator of such de-escalation, we will watch, is there like sort of feasible off-ramps. Third-party mediation offers that both sides acknowledge, or private channel activity becomes public, confirmation of back channels, even indirect, and operational restraint from both sides. Sort of fewer strikes on symbolic, especially from the side of the United States, fewer strikes on symbolic leadership targets, more emphasis on defense and containment. Or, for example, if the UN as a third party or the Security Council diplomacy, we know Security Council diplomacy, in fact, does not stop wars, but it often creates the language of an exit. Also, if we can see clear US signals that regime change is not the objective, and if there is third party mediation with credible guarantees, or domestic political cost spikes that reorder the US payoffs back toward end the war. This requires both Iran keeps retaliation to the minimum and US offers, in fact, a credible off-ramp. What is the impact of sharp energy or oil shock on the global economic pressure? This impact, in fact, the US pay off, making indirectly but systemically. It raises the marginal cost for continuing the war every day. It turns a regional campaign into global cost event, which makes continue until regime collapse much harder to sustain. And there are sort of indicators that this scenario will work if we see like sort of emergency economic language and measures in terms of energy stabilization, market interventions, or feasible allied pressure for de-escalation, and US messaging that reframes goals from end-state transformation and regime to risk reduction or deterrence restoration. If Israel sit back, if Israel sit back weakens the coalition narrative that we must press on total victory to this. In fact, this will flip the US payoff ranking back to end the war and stabilize the region. Instead of finishing regime, or we want to remove the regime, because in the as we remember in the 12 days war, Israel was signaling that they want to stop the war. And now, why is this scenario it could be rational to the USA? Reaching major changes in the regime behavior, meaning that the regime is going towards like or being tamed regime. This exit or scenario offers four payoffs. One, reduces the chaos of a transition complicated period, which is it will be very tough, especially with a country like Iran. Two, ensures that survival of an acceptable form of legitimacy for the new leaders and regime, because you are not going to change the regime. You are going like to change the leaders. So the regime will be as is. The legitimacy of the regime will be as is. And third, paving the way for future gradual radical changes toward a different political system. This could be happen in the future and make it like smooth. And four, ensures that the acceptance of the regime supporters, as they will not witness the complete of the regime collapse. They will witness changing in their leadership, not the collapse of the regime. Scenario number three, or the exit number three, is escalation to overthrow the regime, which is the toughest one. Indicators of each escalation of this escalation is to watch coalition widening, more countries directly hit or pulled in, and responding military. Also, if we watch like UN warnings about the spread is usually a classic marker of widening. The second issue is the credibility trap language. If United States officials continue to say we will not stop until no negotiations, unconditional, all these phrases, these are the phrases that reduce flexibility and make escalation more likely. This scenario means war will continue till the collapse of the regime, which means US and Israel pursue maximalist goals, that is open regime change framing, and Iran directly will be in the mode of nothing to lose. This is the most dangerous phase in war theory. It emerges when regimes, like Iranian regime, survival appears threatened, credibly at stake, and leadership believes collapse is inevitable. The Iranian leadership And the Iranian will see that negotiation is perceived as futile. Here, Iran's risk tolerance rises because when survival is on the line, Iran will accept actions that would normally be too risky because the alternative is collapsing, which is the worst. And concessions look like weakness, and restraint looks like a path to collapse. So the war becomes hard to stop unless the US can credibly signal an exit that does not require collapse. Then pushing Israel from Iran, and also Iran in this scenario will consider like punishing Israel and bombing Israel from the Iran point of view serves three strategic purposes. Deterrence by cost, raise the price of continued maximalist strategy, Israel strategy. Two, alliance splitting, trying to split the alliance between or create pressure on US partners to restrain Israel because of the spillover cost rise. And third, support Iran narrative mobilization to unify domestic support, reduces internal fractures, very important for the Iranian regime. Iran's strategy in this case will be prolonging the war as much as possible to make the war so costly for US and Israel. This, in fact, will lead to a very complex situation where, in this scenario, there are, in fact, very, very complex and serious challenges, such as what are the indicators of a system collapse if this were to occur? That means, what are the criteria for a collapsing system? It is not clear. How could this happen? What is the mechanism? It is unclear. How Iran would be governed is unclear. Would Iran fragment, like goes in fragmented into like Kurdistan, Bashistan, something like this? Or would it remain unified? Not clear in this scenario. Who would be the president? Someone acceptable by the people is not clear. Will the regime really be collapsed that easily? And how successful will that be? Also, it is not unclear. Therefore, this scenario is so vague, and it is really complicated. It is not clear. So now there is the scenario number 4, which is the quagmire. That means the Iranian regime remains cohesive despite all this bombing. What if Iranian regime is holding firm in spite of this bombarding? In this case, the war will be prolonged and is expected escalate towards the following issues. Other countries participate in the war. That could be energy crisis, chain supply crisis, both dollar may be affected, using types of depleted uranium bombs or other destructive weapons that we don't know, US troops forced to be on the ground due to credibility trapped. US has fallen into a quagmire. Therefore, in the long run, the United States, according to this scenario, will fail as it did in Afghanistan and Iraq, and will find itself bogged down in the Iranian quagmire, plunging the region into a period of turmoil and political instability. Now, what are the, we call it, critical turning points? First, the decision to end the war, in fact, rests with the United States. Why? The decision to persist and continue the war rests with Iran. The second issue, turning points in terms of timing. Waiting until the end of March 2026 and we will see, will the first scenario, the unilateral ceasefire, materialize, or the second scenario, that establishment of a moderate regime, so whether explicitly or implicitly, is it working? If the third scenario, that is the complete overthrow of the regime, does not materialize by April 2026, the fourth scenario, the quagmire, is unfortunately expected. So we will wait for till the end of March, hoping that the first scenario and the second scenario will be happened. Otherwise, if also with April The third scenario, which is like overthrowing the regime, also didn't happen. So we are going surely to the first, or expected, in fact, to go to the fourth scenario, fourth exit, which is the quagmire. And unfortunately, this is unexpected. Unfortunately, this will be expected. The continuation of the war and the descent of the region into regional chaos, it will be a problem. That because this will push the whole region to be in a chaos, especially in the Iran and back again, the Middle East will not be stable at all. Now, who are the winners and losers? Losers, in fact, are the US and Iran. And the winner is Israel, who used the USA to destroy its last enemy while it pays the minimum cost. Thank you.